The dog didn't bark. That was the first thing anyone noticed. 600 people had gathered at the Remembrance Ceremony for fallen service animals on a cold Saturday in November, just outside Barrie, Ontario. The maple trees along the perimeter of Centennial Park had gone rust and gold, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere past the parking lot. The crowd stood in orderly rows behind a low rope barrier, bundled in wool coats and scarves, holding programs printed on cream-colored paper. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Elderly veterans held small flags that caught the breeze and snapped every few seconds, like the sound of someone turning pages very quickly. At the front of the ceremony space, 4 RCMP K9 units stood in formation beside their handlers. The dogs were German shepherds. 3 males, 1 female, all of them impeccably trained, all of them facing forward, absolutely still, with the focused, composed dignity that only comes from years of discipline. Their handlers stood rigid beside them, holding leashes taut just above the collar. The crowd watched them with the quiet respect that Canadians reserve for these kinds of ceremonies. Not dramatic, not loud, just present. Nobody in that crowd was watching the woman standing near the back. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, wearing a canvas jacket that had seen better days, her dark hair pulled back under a wool toque that had a small tear along the brim. She stood slightly outside the edge of the gathered crowd, near the folding tables where volunteers had set up coffee urns and trays of butter tarts for after the service. Her name was Laurel Vance. She had driven 4 hours from Wawa that morning, alone, without telling anyone she was coming. She had a paper cup of coffee in both hands, not because she needed 2 coffees, but because she'd grabbed one and then forgotten she was holding it, and then grabbed another when someone offered. She stood looking at the ceremony with an expression that was hard to read from the outside. Not grief, exactly, not joy, something between them that didn't have a clean name. She wasn't there to be recognized. She had no seat at the ceremony because she hadn't registered. She wasn't listed in the program. She wasn't a handler, wasn't RCMP, wasn't a veteran or a sponsor or a dignitary. She was just the woman who had trained those 4 dogs. The ceremony had been underway for about 20 minutes when it happened. Constable Gilles Fontaine, a tall, composed man who had handled police K9s for 11 years, was standing at the edge of the formation with his dog, a 4-year-old male named Kodiak. Kodiak was a big animal, solid and steady, and he'd been trained to hold position through crowds, through noise, through almost anything. In his entire career, Gilles had never seen Kodiak break. Kodiak broke. The dog didn't lunge, didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply turned against the direction of every trained instinct in his body and faced away from the podium. His nose lifted, one ear folded back. The leash went from vertical to angled in half a second. Gilles pulled it. "Steady," he said under his breath. Kodiak sat back down, but his head stayed turned. And then the dog beside him, a younger female named Sable, handled by Constable René Bourque, did the same thing, same turn, same lifted nose, same subtle shiver through the shoulders that looked almost like recognition. By the time the 3rd and 4th dogs had turned, the crowd had noticed. A murmur moved through the people near the rope. A woman in a red coat nudged her husband. 2 children stopped fidgeting. The RCMP sergeant standing at the edge of the staging area, a weathered man named Sergeant Dale Horn, stepped forward slightly with a frown on his face and his hand raised to get the handler's attention. But the dogs weren't looking at Sergeant Horn. They were all looking in the same direction, past the edge of the crowd, past the folding tables, toward the woman standing alone with 2 cups of coffee going cold in her hands. Laurel Vance didn't notice at first. She'd been watching the podium. When she heard the murmuring shift around her, she looked up and found 4 German shepherds and 200 confused faces all pointed at her. She took a small step backward, instinctively. One of her coffees dropped. Kodiak made a sound that Gilles Fontaine later said he had never heard that dog make in 4 years of working together. It wasn't a bark, wasn't a whine, wasn't anything in the standard range of K9 vocalizations that handlers learn to read. It was something lower and more fundamental, a sound from somewhere deep in the chest that vibrated rather than rang. And then, with the kind of single-minded certainty that those dogs usually reserved for tracking a specific scent through 3 kilometers of boreal forest, Kodiak pulled. Gilles held on for about 4 seconds. Then Kodiak pulled again, not aggressively, not frantically, just with a calm, absolute insistence, and the leash slipped through Gilles's grip. All 4 dogs reached her at the same time. The crowd went silent in the way that crowds go silent when something happens that none of them have a script for. Not a ceremony script silence, but a real one. The kind that falls when something genuinely unexpected cuts through the managed atmosphere of a public event and reminds everyone present that they are watching something they don't fully understand. Laurel Vance went down on one knee. She didn't cry. She pressed her face into Kodiak's neck and she held on, and all 4 dogs pushed in around her, pressing their weight against her shoulders, her arms, her sides, and she held all of them as best she could at once. "Who is she?" someone near the rope said. "I have no idea," said the person beside them. Sergeant Horn crossed the distance in about 15 seconds. He was a careful man, cautious, the kind of person who thought before he spoke, which meant he arrived at the edge of the small knot of dogs and women, and stood there for a moment before saying anything. One of the handlers, Constable Bork, was at his shoulder. "Ma'am," Horn said finally, not unkindly. "Can I ask, do you know these animals?" Laurel looked up. She had the look of someone who had just been surprised by something they had been quietly bracing for. "Yes," she said. "Are you a handler? Are you registered with?" "No," she said. "I'm not a handler," she paused. "I trained them." There was a K9 training facility called Northern Shield that used to operate about 45 kilometers east of Sudbury, off a gravel road that didn't appear on most maps because it didn't need to. For 7 years, Northern Shield had been considered one of the best private K9 training operations in northern Ontario. Not the largest, not the most famous, but the kind of place that produced dogs that actually worked. The kind of place where RCMP procurement officers started making quiet phone calls, once word got around, that the dogs coming out of that facility were something different. The person responsible for that reputation was not the man who owned the facility. It was the young woman he'd hired at 22, straight out of a zoology program at Laurentian, who had grown up on a trapline north of White River, and had been reading dog behavior since she was old enough to read anything. Her name, when she started, was Laurel Vance. She came to Northern Shield because she'd answered a handwritten ad posted on a corkboard at a Tim Hortons in Sudbury. The ad read, "Kennel help wanted. Must not be afraid of large dogs. No experience necessary, some experience preferred. Call Gerald." Gerald Mott was 64, a former OPP officer who had trained police dogs for 2 decades before his knees gave out, and he had built Northern Shield more out of stubbornness than business sense. He expected to hire someone who would clean runs and fill water bowls. What showed up was Laurel, who shook his hand, looked at the 6 dogs in the back kennel for about 90 seconds, and told him, unprompted, which 2 of them were anxious and why. He gave her the job that afternoon. Within a year, she was doing more training than anyone else at the facility, including Gerald. Within 3 years, she was running every intake assessment, every structured obedience program, every scent detection curriculum. Gerald, who was not a man given to effusive praise, told a procurement officer from the RCMP in Winnipeg that the dogs they were buying were as good as they were because of the woman who worked for him, and that he didn't fully understand how she did it, but that he'd stopped questioning it. She had a particular way with the difficult ones, the dogs that came in shut down, or feral-edged, or so damaged by bad early handling that most trainers would have washed them out and moved on. Laurel didn't wash dogs out. She started over. She went slower. She sat with them in the run for hours sometimes, not doing anything, not asking anything, just being present. Gerald found her in the kennel at 2 in the morning more than once. She wasn't distressed about it. She brought a thermos. The 4 dogs she trained for the RCMP batch that year were named internally at Northern Shield by the procurement lot number, but Laurel had also given them personal names, which Gerald had told her repeatedly was a bad idea. She did it anyway. Kodiak, Sable, Flint, Arrow. She spoke to them by those names even during formal training sessions, which made the procurement officer from Ottawa mildly uncomfortable when he came for the evaluation. The dogs passed every evaluation metric in the top percentile. The procurement officer stopped being uncomfortable and signed the papers. The dogs shipped to 3 separate postings across Ontario and Manitoba. Laurel watched the transport van leave from the gravel lot in front of the facility. She didn't say anything, standing there in her barn jacket in the February cold, with her hands in her pockets. Gerald stood beside her and didn't say anything either, because he understood without being told that this was something she didn't want commented on. That was 4 years before the ceremony in Barrie. In the months after the dogs shipped, the situation at Northern Shield changed. Gerald's health, which had been quietly declining, declined faster. His son, who lived in Guelph and had no interest in dogs, showed up in March with a real estate agent and a property assessment. The conversation between father and son was conducted behind a closed door, but the kennel staff heard enough of it to understand the general shape. By April, Northern Shield had a for sale sign on the gate. Laurel stayed through the summer, helping wind things down, rehoming the facility dogs, cleaning up records. She left in September with a good reference from Gerald and no clear plan. She had savings. She had a truck. She had the kind of skills that are difficult to put on a resume, but that people in the right circles know about by word of mouth. She moved up to Wawa and spent a year doing contract work, freelance training for hunting operations, a brief contract with a search and rescue organization out of Sault Ste. Marie, some private consultations. The work was enough to live on, but not enough to build anything. She'd been offered positions in 2 different cities, but she'd turned them down for reasons she struggled to fully articulate, even to herself. She didn't know, during those 4 years, what happened to Kodiak and Sable and Flint and Arrow. She didn't ask. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she kept to it. But she thought about them the way you think about something you've set down in a place you trust, hoping it will be safe, not allowing yourself to wonder too specifically. She found out about the ceremony by accident. A woman she'd done some contract work for forwarded her a newsletter from an RCMP community liaison, one of those brief logistical announcements about a public remembrance event for service animals. It was 3 paragraphs long. In the second paragraph, there was a brief mention that the ceremony would include a working demonstration by 4 K9 units currently serving in the Central Ontario district. The names of the dogs were listed in a table at the bottom of the newsletter. Kodiak, Sable, Flint, Arrow. Laurel read the names and didn't move for a while. Then she forwarded the newsletter to herself so she wouldn't lose it, got up, went to the window, and looked out at the Michipicoten River for a long time. She told herself she was just going to see, not to make a thing of it, not to interrupt anything, not to be seen, not to make anyone uncomfortable. She would stand at the back and watch, and then she would drive 4 hours home. That was all. Sergeant Horn did not, as a rule, improvise. Ceremonies had structures, service events had protocols, there were forms for almost every deviation. There was no form for what was currently happening in the middle of the Centennial Park ceremony, which was that 4 fully decorated RCMP K9s had abandoned their handlers and were refusing to leave the side of an unregistered civilian who was sitting cross-legged on the grass with a dog in her lap. He looked at Constable Fontaine. Fontaine shrugged, very slightly, in the way of a man who had just watched his dog make a unilateral decision and wasn't entirely sure he disagreed with it. "Can you tell me your full name?" Horn asked. "Laurel Vance. And you say you trained these specific dogs. Yes, at what facility? Northern Shield. Outside Sudbury. It closed 4 years ago. She looked up at him steadily. She wasn't nervous exactly. She had the calm of someone who knew exactly what they had done and were simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I trained all 4 of them from intake. Flint and Arrow went to Manitoba. These 2 stayed in Ontario. She put her hand on Kodiak's head. He pressed into it. I can tell you their intake weights, their original temperament assessments, their scent detection records. I can tell you which one had a bad shoulder in his first year of training that we rehabbed with a physio program. I can tell you which one is afraid of plastic tarps and why. Horn said, "Which one?" She nodded towards Sable. Her. She came from a breeder in Kenora who kept plastic sheeting over the kennel runs. She associates the sound with being locked in somewhere. She's fine in the field. The exposure work took care of most of it. But if there's heavy plastic crinking nearby in a confined space, she still checks for the exit. Horn looked at Constable Bork. Bork's expression shifted in a way that confirmed everything. "How did you get here today?" Horn asked. "Drove from Wawa this morning. Were you invited?" "No." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why did you come?" She was quiet for a second. A wind came through the park and the maple leaves moved. "I just wanted to see them," she said. "I wasn't going to bother anyone." She said it plainly, without asking for anything in it, which is perhaps why it was the thing that stayed with everyone who heard it later. Behind Sergeant Horn, the crowd at the rope had pressed forward as far as the barrier would allow. The MC at the podium had abandoned the prepared remarks and was simply watching like everyone else. A woman in a red coat near the front was holding her phone up. 2 television cameras that had come to cover the ceremony had swiveled in the same direction. None of that seemed to reach Laurel. She was looking at the dogs. The story that came out over the next hour, in fragments at first, and then in more detail as the ceremony quietly dissolved into something less formal, was one that the people present would tell for years. Gerald Mott, reached by phone that afternoon, confirmed everything. "Laurel Vance," he said, when the RCMP liaison called him, "is the best dog trainer I ever saw, and I was doing this job before she was born. So that's not a small thing to say." He had sold the facility, he explained, not because he wanted to, but because he'd run out of road. He said this without self-pity, just as information. If I could have found a way to hand the whole thing to Laurel, I would have. She knew those dogs better than I knew my own kids. An archival search of Northern Shield's procurement records, which Gerald had kept in 4 bankers' boxes in his garage in Sudbury, confirmed that Laurel Vance had been the primary trainer on file for RCMP Batch 7C, which included Kodiak, Sable, Flint, and Arrow. The records included her initial assessments, her training logs, her scent detection certification documentation. Her name appeared on every relevant form, in the same careful, spare handwriting. The dogs themselves continued to make the argument. For the remainder of the afternoon, while people milled around, and the volunteer tables were refilled, and the formal structure of the ceremony gently collapsed into something more like a gathering, all 4 dogs stayed close to Laurel. Not frantic, not needy, just present, the way dogs are present with people they know. Kodiak lay across her feet at one point, which his handler found both inexplicable and completely unsurprising. Arrow, who had been driven down from his posting in Portage la Prairie specifically for the ceremony, kept his head in her lap for 20 minutes while she sat on a folding chair someone had brought over. A journalist from the Barrie Examiner asked Laurel if he could interview her. She said, "I don't think so, but thank you." He asked why. She thought about it. "I didn't do anything that needs a story," she said. "I just trained some dogs." She said it in the tone of someone making a simple factual statement, but the journalist wrote it down anyway. He published it in a piece that ran 2 days later, alongside a photograph that someone in the crowd had taken on their phone. Laurel cross-legged on the grass, all 4 dogs around her, her face turned down into Kodiak's neck, the crowd a blur of wool coats behind her. The headline was quiet, almost understated by the standards of the paper's usual style. But people shared it. Sergeant Horn, before the afternoon was over, found Laurel standing alone again near the edge of the park, getting ready to leave. She had her truck keys out. He had made 2 phone calls and pulled a single records check in the previous hour. He was a methodical man, and he'd done what you do when you want to understand something. You trace it back to its beginning, and you look at what you find there. He had found exactly what she said he'd find. "Mrs. Vance," he said. She stopped. "I talked to a contact at RCMP headquarters about a staffing gap they've had in their K9 development unit for the past 18 months. He folded his hands behind his back, which was how he stood when he was trying to be precise. "The position is in Innisfil. It's a senior training role. The reason it hasn't been filled is that the people who've applied haven't been able to replicate the results of the previous trainer." He paused. The previous trainer was contracted out of Northern Shield. Laurel looked at him. "I know," she said. "That was you," he said. "Yes." He nodded. "I've taken the liberty of recommending your name. Informally, you'd still need to go through the application process." He said it carefully because he was a careful man, but there was something underneath the precision that was a little warmer than procedure. "I thought you should know." She looked out at the park for a moment. The folding tables were being collapsed and stacked. The maple trees had gone darker in the low November light. Somewhere behind her, she could hear one of the dogs, Sable, probably by the pitch, making a small sound. "Okay," she said. He nodded once and turned to go. "Sergeant," she said. He stopped. "Tell them I'll apply," she said. "Tell them I'm done with the drive back and forth." He almost smiled. "I'll tell them." She walked to her truck. She sat in it for a minute in the parking lot, without starting the engine, her hands on the wheel, looking out through the windshield at the park. The light was going fast, the way it does in Ontario in November, dropping from afternoon into near dark in the space of 40 minutes. The last few people were filtering out through the gate. The dogs were being loaded into their transport vehicles by their handlers. Kodiak, being loaded into Constable Fontaine's vehicle, stopped and looked back once. It might have been at nothing. It might have been at the direction of a sound or a scent on the wind. But it was long enough that Gilles Fontaine noticed it, and, being a man who had worked with dogs for 11 years and had learned what that kind of look meant, he did not rush it. He waited. Then Kodiak stepped up into the vehicle, and Gilles closed the door carefully behind him, and Laurel started her truck and pulled out of the lot and began the 4-hour drive back to Wawa. Though she already knew, in the quiet, settled way of a decision that's been made before you've formally made it, that she wouldn't be making that drive again.